Hi, my name is Bridget Richardson. I'm the Assistant Director of Ecumenical and Pastoral Initiatives at the Nesty Center for Faith and Culture at University of St. Thomas in Houston. And I'm here with Dr. Hans Stockton. He's the Dean for the Division of Social and Behavioral Sciences and Global Studies. He's the Director of the Taiwan and East Asia Studies Program, and he's the Fayez Sarofim Cullen Trust for Higher Education Endowed Chair in International Studies. So Dr. Stockton, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning, Bridget.
So we're going to talk about something that just happened recently in Houston that personally I was confused about. I didn't know how to interpret it, so I reached out to you to help me understand a little better. And that's the Chinese consulate closing in the United States. And also some more news has come out about that situation. So maybe you can just lay the groundwork a little bit about it. I know you've been featured on the news locally in a lot of different places discussing it. So maybe we can talk about it from a faith and culture aspect.
Okay, well, to start with the basics of what has actually transpired, as of 4 o'clock today, Friday, July 24th, the People's Republic of China consulate here in Houston is to be vacated and that consulate to be closed. This is in retaliation for charges against the PRC of espionage, public influence operations that were being coordinated out of the Houston office. I think your community's probably seen many stories about Chinese espionage, cyber hacking, and several instances recently here in the Houston area involving COVID research, an episode or two at Intercontinental Airport involving consular staff, etc. So the closure of the consulate by the Trump administration is a signal of obvious great displeasure by the United States government.
Okay, and then from that, what does that imply in terms of our relationship with China? How do we interpret that from, I guess, just a very relational standpoint?
Mm-hmm. Well, the relationship is not good. You didn't need to bring me on to say anything like that or to know anything like that. There's trade war, there's cyber espionage, there's human rights violations in Xinjiang. There's China's heavy-handed treatment of Hong Kong, U.S. support of Taiwan vis-a-vis China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is a continuation of that. In one sense, it's an escalation, diplomatically speaking, because we have never closed a Chinese consulate in the United States since the first one opened in 1979, and that first one being here in Houston. It's yet another tool in our government's toolbox to express obvious displeasure and of course retaliation against Chinese actions. Now, what it means for the U.S.-Chinese relationship could be the rest of the hour. The Chinese announced this morning, or about 12 hours ago, they were closing the American consulate in Chengdu, which is what you could call a balanced, reciprocal, symmetric response to our closure of their consulate. And this is a very important one, and that is that they maintained what pretty much anyone that understands diplomacy and diplomatic action would have assumed would happen, and that was the closure of that particular office. They didn't go for Shanghai, for example, which would have been big, like an escalation. And so that response is actually somewhat encouraging because it tells us there still is some kind of system. There's it's a game of chicken, but there are some rules to it, right? Now, what's particular about the Chengdu consulate, or American consulate, I should say, in Chengdu being closed is we now lose our eyes on the ground with regard to what's going on in Xinjiang and what's going on with Chinese actions in Central Asia through their Silk Road initiatives. And so it is a loss. It's not just a loss of American, the U.S. granting visas for Chinese citizens to come to the U.S. It's a tangible loss to us in an information sense, just as the closure of the Houston office was for the Chinese. But maybe later in the conversation we can talk about, is this another Cold War, or where is it going from here, and all that stuff. But I'll stop right there.
Well, that's what, in informing myself about it, that's what I've read, is that type of rhetoric. So maybe you can just touch on that right now.
Oh, you're gonna get me. You're gonna turn me geeky a
That's
little
all
too
right. Let's
quick.
do it.
Well, so this conflict between the U.S. and China is often framed and phrased as if it's a new Cold War. And that's semantically or rhetorically attractive. It holds a lot of meaning that we think we want to convey about what this conflict is turning into. But we have to remember that the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was a global ideological struggle between democracy and capitalism, liberalism, versus the illiberalism of communism as a political and economic and social system. The US-China struggle is nowhere near that yet. The Chinese are not actively trying to sell a Chinese ideological model. And in fact, they're very secular, so to speak, in what they are selling. And that's economic trade, influence, but they're not actively trying to impose a particular political ideology on governments. Now, they are very happy to work with corrupt, autocratic, lawless nations, as long as it makes them money, and as long as it makes their partner state autocrats money, right? All right, so there's one difference, and that's a big difference when we use this Cold War language. The second difference is that throughout the Cold War, the Americans and Soviets were from the very beginning largely isolated from each other. There wasn't a lot of exchange, right? There were travel visas, entry visas, exit visas. There was no free flow of people like we have even today. People, ideas, commerce, right? The East and the West were largely isolated. So what does it mean for the US-China conflict when our two countries were already integrating, and to a large part integrated, before tensions took this turn? And even while tensions are so high, farmers, my family in Kansas is still selling wheat to the Chinese. We're still, oil and gas capital of the world, dealing with Chinese energy concerns. There are Chinese tourists in Houston taking pictures of the consulate about to be closed down the street. So again, this Cold War framework, it doesn't, that in that sense, it doesn't make sense. Where we're headed is good old-fashioned great power rivalry. And it looks more like the kinds of rivalries we saw, in the, prior to the 20th century in Europe. It's a little bit imperial. It's a little bit, it's not so much colonial, but a little bit imperialistic. But it's about power and power. It's really not about ideas right now. So there you go. There's a primer.
Yeah, and how do you think that the rivalry and that pursuit of power will influence down to our level, the American people who are trying to figure it out or make decisions about the situations?
So I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, actually, he supplies apartment complexes and multi-family building developers with toilets, sinks. They're kind of ceramic appliances for the home. And that's his particular area. He gets almost all of that from Chinese manufacturers. Okay, and so when a year, 2 years ago, when the trade dispute really heated up and additional tariffs were applied to Chinese imports to the US, he was paying as much as 15, 20%, or he was going to have to pay as much as 15 or 20% for bringing these things into the US. Now, between himself and his Chinese suppliers, he managed to actually only pay about an additional 10% because the supplier was cutting their prices a little bit. But since then, he's having increasing trouble with customs, his goods leaving and coming. He's having trouble with timely delivery, from production facility to port within China. And now, because he does his business through the U.S. consulate, the Chinese consulate here in Houston, he's got to go somewhere else for his travel visas. Right now, we're not going to China right now. We haven't been for a while. But if this was a normal time and people were expecting to get that business trip to Shanghai or wherever else, take that flight tonight, they wouldn't be doing it. If they didn't already have. So his life is going to become even more complicated. And so there's a particular kind of personal story of like a real life person who doesn't want to be involved in geopolitics or ideological great power struggles or whatever they might be.
Yeah, I think it's so essential to think about that person, when we are having these discussions, because that's the very practical way that people are living their life day to day. And I don't know, is there any effect on students in that way when a consulate like that closes?
Well, so the Chinese consulate here in Houston served the entirety of the U.S. South and Southeast, from Texas all the way to Florida. So any Chinese student wanting to come to the U.S. was applying for, was being processed through those areas, or I should say, any of our students wanting to go out of the U.S. to China were coming to the U.S. U.S. China consulate, Houston, Florida. Sorry, we're going to the consulate here in Houston to get that paperwork. So whether it was business, tourism, student. Right? If you were an American citizen going to China, you were having to deal with the Houston office. Now, with that closed, I mean, if you've got an application for anything or paperwork, you should probably expect it to maybe disappear. Now, do you go to the Chinese embassy? Do you get rerouted to one of the other 4 remaining Chinese consulates? So there's going to be a major disruption, at least for the next 2 or 3 months, while the Chinese themselves figure out how to manage all that, right? Well, in the meantime, you're an American student who's expecting to do something with China. Again, COVID and, travel bans and all that is, kind of makes a lot of this academic-y or hypothetical. But you're a Chinese citizen here in Houston, and you have a crisis. You're here in Houston as a tourist. Your son gets very sick, or some other major incident. You'd normally go to the Chinese consulate for assistance, right? I mean, they have expat services or overseas services. As of 4 o'clock today, that's gone. So then, where do those folks go for help, right? And so there's very real human circumstances. And what I worry about is, would be the Chinese students we have here at UST. What do we need to do to help them? What do we have the power to do to help, right? How we can assist them. And so, and I know the university is taking a look at, and it always does, how to care for our international students, let alone our Chinese international students.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion when so many things that happen politically, like you were saying, that are so top level, when they do get down to the level of just everyday life, it throws a wrench in things. And, I want to just touch on finally, maybe a little bit about human dignity and how this situation affects our understanding of the other. Like, do you see some of this rivalry for power and thought about being against Chinese government? Do you see that filtering out in maybe less positive ways, even in American people? Or even, in the very practical ways of just not being able to go to the consulate for things that you desperately need?
So I think one of the big distinctions we have to keep front and center is that the larger context of this is between the government of the United States and the government of China and the Chinese Communist Party. All right. So we can have a great deal of trepidation, suspicion, fear, relative to the People's Republic of China. But then the whole other level, the human level, is the individuals, right? We should hold great love in our hearts for Chinese citizens, Americans of Chinese descent, as we should with any other human being. And and unfortunately, I think a lot of people confuse that, assume that everyone that quote unquote looks Chinese must be a Communist Party member, or is even Chinese, let alone, or is even actually a Chinese citizen, let alone. My wife's mother immigrated to the United States as a young woman from Taiwan via China, and has faced her own struggles her whole life, being of Chinese descent in the American South. And she's more red, white, and blue than many multi-generation Americans I know. She is faithful to the country. She leads her life with love and compassion, often in her own style as a mother-in-law. So we need to remember that, and that we should always be driven. And this kind of gets into your domain, Bridget. But the ideas and the values of encounter and dialogue should always be front and center. That we have to create encounters with each other as states, as individuals, so that we can have dialogue. Because without the dialogue, nothing good can happen. And without the encounter, there can be no dialogue. And so as the US and China begin to whittle away the ways that we can encounter each other, we are whittling away ways that we can engage in dialogue. And I hate to spoil the good mood, but there ain't no angels in this competition. And if I wanted to be really, really pessimistic, I'd say there are only victims. Now, that doesn't mean that the U.S. should kind of roll over. No, of course not. We have to protect our national interest, but we have to continue to say encounter and dialogue is most important. And whether it's countries, foreign service officers, or encountering someone just walking through our campus, to go out of your way to smile at someone, to make them know that they are appreciated and loved as a human being.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stockton, because that, for me at least, it helps put it in perspective, because I always think in the faith and culture realm, where did the two connect? How are the two interfacing with each other? And that helps me think a lot about when I read these articles and I see different news reports, like what deeper issues might be at play here.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, if there's, do we have more time, or are you
Yeah.
guys
Oh,
cutting
yeah.
out? So, I'll admit I'm probably as guilty as the next guy. When I read about what China's doing in Hong Kong, in the South China Sea, its intimidation of our friends in Taiwan, its intimidation of its own citizens. I got to tell you, my reaction, my gut reaction is, there they go again. The U.S., we've got to be strong against this, and no one else is going to protect these people the way we can, right? Victims of human rights violations, et cetera. And so there's my kind of nationalistic knee jerk, let's go to work. But again, I then have to remind myself that, okay, at the end of the day, it's individual humans that are going to suffer the consequences of what big states do, big powers, great powers, right? And that's kind of the governor to this nationalistic passion that overcomes me every now and then. Like, okay, slow down, be thoughtful, understand, and move forward from there.
Well, it's a game changer in the way that you think about politics and what happens, right? If you just have that shift in mindset.
Yeah, and that's why one of the classic strategies is to dehumanize your opponent, because you then remove that most important human dimension that checks our, is it id? I forgot. It's, my psychology's a long time ago, but that compassion is what checks our knee-jerk response. And if you dehumanize each other, which is what we're going to start to see in this rivalry, then all you've got left is that high-level nationalistic kind of response. And when you start to see that, now the Chinese have said a lot of horrible things about Trump, President Trump, idiot, removed from reality. I mean, very personal kinds of insults, but they haven't said that Americans are evil, right? And the US government has accused China of a lot of things, and we've accused them of engaging in the most atrocious behaviors against their own people, which are documented. But we haven't said the Chinese people are evil. When we start seeing that, that's when things are going to start getting bad.
Well, thank you for that too, because that helps put it in a really, I mean, it's such an important.
Oh, good and evil.
Yeah.
That's perfect for you guys.
Right, exactly. So thank you so much, Dr. Stockton. It's always so great to talk with you and to get more information and understanding. And you have a wonderful way of just helping us come right out with the facts and what we should be looking for in the future as well.
Bridget, I've really enjoyed this, and I appreciate the invitation. I wish you and everybody in the CFC family all the best and good health.